Welcome. I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law here at UC Berkeley and co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. And I want to welcome you to our program tonight, the last event for the Helen Diller Institute of the semester, featuring author and Shalom Hartman Institute Senior Fellow Yossi Klein Halevi, and UC Berkeley Professor of History Ethan Katz, in a conversation entitled Debates Over Zionism and the Future of the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. The event is hosted by the Helen Diller Institute and co-sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies, of which Ethan Katz is the faculty director. Helen Diller Institute provides deep support, engagement, and mentorship to thousands of students. We bring 7 to 10 visiting faculty and scholars to Berkeley annually, enabling courses in a dozen departments across campus. We coordinate public, academic, and student programs. We host an undergraduate fellows program, experiential learning programs in Israel, and was announced just a few weeks ago, we will launch an Israel Studies minor at UC Berkeley beginning in fall 2024. All of our pub programs are enabled entirely by philanthropic support. So we're grateful to all of our supporters, to the supporters in the community who are here today. Thank you for your partnership. We encourage you to continue supporting this important work. It has never been more important. And as part of that work tonight, we're honored to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi in conversation with Professor Ethan Katz. Before I introduce them fully, I just want to note that we really encourage folks to ask questions through a note card process. Hopefully, if you're interested in asking a question, you took a note card at sign-in, but if not, Alexa Kennard will be walking around with note cards, and they'll be passed out and brought so that Professor Katz can lump them and relay them. Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and co-host with Danielle Hartman and Ilana Stein-Hain of the Hartman Institute's award-winning podcast, For Heaven's Sake. He's also the author of Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, which won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award, and also At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, a Jew's search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. His first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, told the story of his teenage attraction to and subsequent disillusionment with Jewish militancy. The New York Times called it a book of burning importance. Yossi writes for the op-ed pages of leading American newspapers and is a former contributing editor of the New Republic. Ethan Katz. Professor Ethan Katz is currently Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UC Berkeley. He's the author of the award-winning The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North America to France, and he's the co-editor of several other volumes, including Colonialism and the Jews, and most recently, When Jews Argue, Between the University and the Beit Midrash. At the moment, he's completing a new book entitled Jews and Other Strangers, Dilemmas of Zionism, Colonialism, and Anti-Zionism. Professor Katz's writing has appeared in popular venues such as The Atlantic, the Jewish Review of Books, Haaretz, and The Forward, and he's been interviewed on NPR and the PBS NewsHour. Ethan has also played a leading and thoughtful role in promoting complex and often difficult dialogues about anti-Semitism on college campuses. He's the chair of the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Student Life and Campus Climate. He's co-founder of the campus's Anti-Semitism Initiative, and he's co-chair of the Association for Jewish Studies Task Force on Anti-Semitism and Academic Freedom. In these roles, he's worked towards creating guidelines of education and engagement for students, campus leaders, and teachers across the United States. Through his scholarship and his public-facing work, he's had wide-ranging experience in dialoguing across differences. I couldn't be happier than to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi to our campus. Please show our gratitude.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so. Okay. Let's see. Is this better?
It's not on. Right?
How's this? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I might take the mic out. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much to Ken for those very kind words of introduction. For me, it is an extraordinary honor and privilege to be in conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi, someone who I have long admired and whose work has influenced me in various ways. Let's start our conversation, Yossi, with one of our key words for this program and really for this moment in our public discourse on and off campuses, Zionism. This word has been the subject of so much debate, and I would argue a great deal of misunderstanding, or at best incomplete understanding, in recent years, and all the more so in recent months. Can you talk about what Zionism's meant in your own life journey, and then say a bit about whether you think it has more particular meaning or definition in this specific post-October 7th moment?
Thank you, Ken, for the warm introduction. And Ethan, I'm just delighted to get to know you and to be in conversation with you. And good evening, everyone. The question about Zionism for me has nothing to do with ideology. And I think that that's true certainly for my generation of American Jews. As you can hear from my accent, I grew up here. Not literally here, the other end of America, in a neighborhood called Borough Park, which was somewhere between Poland and the Ukraine, but was officially part of the United States. And for me, growing up in a survivor home, which was infused with gratitude for the existence of Israel, Zionism was not an ideology. Zionism was oxygen. It was the ability of my father and his friends, even those of his friends who were part of Hasidic groups that officially were anti-Zionist, like Satmar, the survivors, my father's circle of friends, were all Zionists. And for them, Zionism meant, very simply, that there's hope for Jews in the world, that the Holocaust was not the last word on Jewish existence. And it was much deeper, and this is only something that I was able to articulate.
Yes, sorry. It'll be easier.
Okay, what I'm going to say now is not something that I would have been able to articulate when I was younger, but for my father and for the survivor generation, as I knew them, the power of Israel went far deeper than Israel as a safe refuge. And Ethan, when I'm speaking about Israel and Zionism interchangeably, because that's certainly how I grew up. The other survivors, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox survivors in Borough Park, had photographs on their walls of leading rabbis. And in our home, we had a picture of Herzl with his long beard and bareheadedness. He was the Zionist Rebbe. And that's how I related to him. And what I realized later on was that for my father and his friends, the fulfillment of the dream of Zionism was a direct response to the apocalyptic imagination that created the Holocaust. And the Germanic, Teutonic, apocalyptic imagination envisioned a world of perfect death. And that's what the death camps were. And for my father and his friends, the ability of the Jewish people to respond to the Nazis' apocalyptic imagination, but with a counter imposition on history of the Jewish redemptive imagination, meant that it was possible to continue to dream again in history. That Zionism saved history. It saved this world for the Jews. And that was something that I think I understood intuitively growing up, but became explicit only much later. I don't know if I've explained exactly what. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I believe that I do.
I better say more.
If I hear you, part of what you're saying is that whereas the Nazis had essentially attempted to extinguish Jewish history, Zionism was a reclamation, in a sense, of Jewish history, a reclamation of Jewish agency.
Yes, but there's another level, because what the death camps were the fulfillment of the Teutonic apocalyptic imagination. And what Zionism was a secular version of the Jewish messianic vision. And so the only response that would have been strong enough to counter the apocalyptic imagination that was fulfilled in the death camps was Jerusalem, the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. And that, I believe, was the unspoken, largely unarticulated, intuitive understanding of the survivors who I knew. That Zionism reclaimed the credibility of Jewish history, the credibility of the redemptive imagination as opposed to the apocalyptic imagination. And so when I say that Zionism had nothing to do with ideology in my home, it made it possible for my father to see himself as part of humanity. Because the message of the Nazis was the Jews are not part of the human race. And many survivors immediately after the war, my father was certainly among them, internalized that message and said there are the Gentiles, or to use the Borough Park terminology, the Goyim, and the Jews. And that was the atmosphere in which I grew up. And it took me a long time, and it happened, I think, only once I moved to Israel, when I realized that Zionism actually had promised the Jewish people two forms of return. There was a return to the land of Israel, to the ancient homeland, and there was also the return to the community of nations. And for the survivors, there was nothing abstract about it. It meant a return to considering oneself a part of humanity. And that was not at all a given for the survivor generation. And I know that because it wasn't a given for me growing up. I thought of the world, there was the Jews and the world, even the terminology. The world, we used to speak about the world as if it was some hostile place or extraneous to the Jews. And when I moved to Israel, I realized that what Israel really is about is not only a return to the land, it was our admission back into humanity. And I think of the two flags on the bima of most American synagogues, maybe even in Berkeley. And what those two flags symbolized for me was the entwinement of the two success stories after the Holocaust. Those two flags represented the ability of the Jewish people to find their place within the wider world. And of course, those two flags, each in their own way and also together, the entwinement of those two flags is very much under attack. And if you're asking what Zionism means since October 7th, it's recognizing that the astonishing post-Holocaust Jewish success story, and I'm writing a book about that now, and it's really about the two flags on the bima, and what those two flags did for the Jewish people. The ability of the Jews to transition from the lowest point in our history, which was 1945, to what I regard as the peak moment of Jewish history, which maybe one could say was October 6th, 2023. We don't know yet. We're clearly in a new era. We don't yet know what it is. But those 70, 80 years were, I think, the greatest years of Jewish history. And that's a big statement, but I really believe that there was no greater example of Jewish perseverance, of our ability to turn destruction into a kind of redemption than these last 70, 80 years. And that's what's under assault now, the legitimacy of the post-Holocaust Jewish success story. And so what we need to own and to celebrate is and to express gratitude for what Zionism did for the Jewish people. What those stubborn, and there was no one more stubborn, and sometimes no one more obnoxious than those early Zionists. And what they did was create the ground intuitively, because Zionism, of course, began many decades before the Holocaust, but intuitively to create the ground for the Jewish resurrection. And I'll just add one last point here, Ethan, which is that from an Israeli perspective, what I've just said is only part of the story. Because as I think we all know by now, a majority of Jews in Israel don't come from Ashkenazi families and don't have the background that I had. And what Zionism did was really, and in very difficult ways, and in many ways very ugly ways, certainly in the way Mizrahim were treated in the early decades of the state. And what Zionism nevertheless did was retrieve the two centers of the most vital Jewish life, Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And both of those centers were either destroyed or, in the case of the Jews in the Middle East, under severe threat, partly because of Zionism itself, it's true, but also partly because of decolonization. Zionism created the place where these communities could be reconstituted. And so Zionism saved the vitality of the Jewish people. And so that's I would say there's so much for me to say on, and this is it, for me, it's like asking me to speak about my family, which I did. It's inseparable from my being. And attacks on Zionism, for me, are the most personal attacks possible. It's attacking my children, quite literally. It's attacking my Israeli children. And it's attacking my father. It's an assault on my family. And that's how I respond viscerally to what's been happening.
Yeah, thank you, Yossi. I mean, part of what I hear you saying is that for so many of us, Zionism is basic to our sense of being and consciousness in the world. And so when it's being attacked as if it's simply a chosen political position taken off a shelf like other chosen political positions, it feels profoundly threatening to our sense of being in the world and our sense of how we orient ourselves. And I think that's very right. And I think that's very difficult for many people to understand, who, depending on generationally, politically, your background. I think it's part of what we're, I think, trying to communicate in many conversations today, to get beyond something that's sort of a superficial tit-for-tat debate. But I know that everything you just said, and I think it's part of the beauty of your work, it doesn't lead you to avoiding hard questions about Israel and about Israel's actions. So let's talk about the very challenging and in many ways painful intersections right now in this war in Israel and Gaza between power, victimhood, and vulnerability. I've heard you say that you do not think that Israelis, supporters of Israel, should engage in the self-pity of victimhood, but that you also do not believe it is fair to see Israel as a victimizer either. So can you say more about that?
So we're caught in a very strange loop at the moment, where as a result of October 7th, many Jews, even many Israelis who, the Israeli ethos is to despise victimhood. We've always said in Israel, we've prided ourselves on saying we'd rather be hated than pitied, and sometimes you should be careful what you ask for. But October 7th was experienced by Israelis, and I think by diaspora Jews as well, as a return to the condition of Jewish victimhood. And the way that that's phrased in Israel, and you hear this a lot these days, is that on October 7th, Israel returned to Jewish history. And by that we mean the dark periods of Jewish history, which Israel and Zionism were supposed to free us from. The problem with remaining, and I understand why October 7th was experienced that way. I think that was it was not a manipulation, as we heard from Jonathan Glazer the other week, who basically was accusing Jews of using the Holocaust, manipulating the Holocaust. A profound misunderstanding of the deep emotional, the trauma with which Israelis and Jews around the world responded to October 7th. But October 7th was followed by October 8th. And on October 8th, the Israeli public, from left to right, to center to right, and I can't emphasize that enough, it was virtually the entirety of the left, along with the center and the right, that agreed that we cannot allow the disastrous perception of the return of Jewish victimhood to stand. And we need to go into Gaza. As ugly as that's going to be, no one had any illusions in Israel about what this war would look like. And yet, the necessity of going into Gaza was supported virtually wall to wall by Jewish Israelis. And I'm clearly making a distinction here between Jewish Israelis and Arab or Palestinian Israelis. But in Jewish Israeli society, virtually the entirety supported not only the need to go to war, but the goal of the war, which was to destroy Hamas. And so, in taking that position, in inflexing our power in the most horrific way, the worst war that Israel has ever fought, the most brutal, the ugliest war we have ever fought. And yet 6 months later, there is still virtual unanimity in support, at least, of the moral justification for this war. There is the beginning of a debate about how do we end this. Maybe it's time to wrap this war up and bring this government down, a position that I'm increasingly supporting, even though I do believe that the goal needs to still be destroying the Hamas regime. So once we made that decision to fight this ugly war, we no longer had the right to see ourselves as victims. We willingly forfeited that identity, as I believe we had to. Because the post-Holocaust story of the Jewish people is that we had experienced an excess of victimhood, and victimhood had become untenable. And in assuming power, and I regard the Jewish reclamation of power to be one of the most important decisions that the Jewish people ever made in its history. But that requires owning the identity of power. It requires taking responsibility for power. And that means, for me, in relation to this war, that means two things. First of all, realizing that a powerful people cannot return to the identity of victim. We don't have the right to see ourselves as victims. And this idea that we are somehow in competition with the Palestinians for victimhood, that October 7th is worse than what we're doing in Gaza, that's an irrelevant conversation. We will never win a competition of victimhood with the Palestinians, and I don't want to win that competition. And so, on the one hand, we have no right to be victims, to consider ourselves victims, because we have rejected victimhood, and that's the essence, or part of the essence, of Israeliness. On the other hand, the other side of this loop is how much of the world perceives us as victimizers. And that, to me, is no less a distortion. Because what Israel is doing in Gaza is what any nation in our place would do. And given the conditions in which the Hamas infrastructure is totally entwined with the civilian infrastructure, we had one of two choices: to allow Hamas to massacre us and then escape back across the border and seek immunity behind Gaza's civilian infrastructure, which is really what happened in all of our previous wars in Gaza. We essentially gave Hamas immunity behind their civilians. What we decided in this war is no more immunity. We're going into hospitals, as we have done. We're going into schools, into mosques, certainly into UN facilities, which are often interchangeable, or covers for Hamas facilities. No more immunity. That was the decision that Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society as a whole, made. And so we're all implicated in that decision, and I stand by that decision. And so we need to free ourselves from this pathological loop of moving between the self-pity of victims and the criminalization of those who would regard us as victimizer. Neither category, victim nor victimizer, is useful in understanding post-October 7th Israel.
So, I think that was very well put. I want to push you a little bit because you spoke of, I think, from what I can understand, quite accurately about the level of political unanimity in Israel, although, as you noted, it seems to be beginning to break down. But as you're aware, of course, there are many harder questions being asked vocally not only by Israel's fiercest critics, but by many of Israel's close friends overseas, particularly in this country. Questions about the justice of the war itself, and particularly questions about whether. So I'm wondering how you respond to those questions and how you think Israel should respond to those questions.
So Ethan, I think you made an important distinction when you said that there are hard questions being asked by Israel's friends. And there are really two basic critiques that we're hearing. One comes from Israel's enemies, from those who have decided that we are an illegitimate state. We are the criminal among nations. And Israel's war is illegitimate because Israel has no right to defend itself. Israel was founded in sin. It is a colonialist, apartheid, and now genocidal state. And Nazi Germany had no right to defend itself, and neither does the state of Israel. That's one critique. And in the face of that critique, my only response is unequivocal pushback. I owe that critique no moral accountability. The second critique comes from our friends, the Biden administration, Germany, a few other European countries, growing parts of the American Jewish community. And there, I have the responsibility to take that criticism seriously. I don't have to agree with all of it, and I don't. But I have to listen, especially the criticism that comes from fellow Jews. And this really is for me, it is the inevitable consequence of Zionism itself. Zionism insisted that the state of Israel would occupy the same place in global Jewish life as the land of Israel occupied in the imagination of the Jewish people for 2,000 years of exile. And so if we expect world Jewry to see Israel as the center of Jewish life and to be engaged with Israel, there's a price to pay for that. And that price is that I have a responsibility to listen to what Jews around the world are saying. And Israel today is so traumatized and so self-referential, and I feel this as well. This is my first trip outside of Israel since October 7th, and it's a shock, because suddenly I'm not surrounded by people who are all going through exactly the process that I'm going through. We're an insomniac nation. The whole country is traumatized. It is still October 7th. I understand why the rest of the world has moved on, but for us, it's still October 7th. And so it's very hard for us in Israel to see ourselves. It's hard for us to see what this war looks like in the world. Now, I've been defending this war from the beginning, and I will continue to. But it's also really important for me to have friends around the world, especially in the Jewish community, who will hold up a mirror to me and say, look, this is what much of the world is seeing. And you need to at least confront that. So I need that from American Jews. And so how I would answer the question of are we fighting a just war justly? I would say that there is really no way to fight this war in the big picture in a way other than the IDF is fighting this. And that doesn't mean that I don't have questions. First of all, I can say unequivocally, we do not target civilians. And I can say that unequivocally, excuse me, because the IDF is not an abstract. It's not a volunteer army. The IDF is us. It's us, it's our kids, it's our friends, children, grandchildren. We know people who are coming back from the front all the time. We have some idea of what's going on there. And we know the IDF from our own personal experience. And I can say unequivocally, no, we do not target civilians. Can I say with equal certainty that in this war we have done everything possible to protect the innocent? No, I can't say that. And that leaves room for necessary self-reckoning. And if Israeli society is largely incapable of that self-reckoning because we're so traumatized, because we're so angry, then that's all the more reason why diaspora Jews need to be heard, and your concerns need to be heard. I have other questions. I have questions, deep questions about government policy. And this I spent the last year leading up to October 7th demonstrating literally every Saturday night against this terrible government. I did everything I could to try to bring this government down. And so the questions that I have come with no expectations of this government's moral credibility. Still, my question here is two questions. First, why did it require the Biden administration to initiate food relief for Gazans? Why didn't we assume that? That's our responsibility. We are in Gaza, we are devastating Gaza, and we have at the very least a responsibility to ensure that there isn't famine. And somehow that wasn't on the radar. Not only of this government, that doesn't surprise me, but the IDF should have placed this the center of its, and you know what, not even for moral reasons, strategic reasons. The IDF should have understood by now that the more misery there is in Gaza, the less time we have to fight this war. It is in our strategic interest to have a basic humanitarian policy. And the other question is directed to the government, and it's not a question at all, again, because I have no expectations, but how is it possible that we have no morning after plan? Because without a morning after, we're going to be sucked back into the Gaza quagmire. I served as a soldier in the Gaza refugee camps. My son fought a war in Gaza, and I certainly don't want us to be back in Gaza in any way as soon as this war is over. So those are the questions that I and they're not the same questions that are being asked in the Jewish community here. They're different questions. I mean, there is some overlap, but I think most Israelis would affirm the basic humaneness of Israeli soldiers. Now, it's not a blanket judgment. We know that there are, we see it on clips of these reckless soldiers who send back these clips of humiliating Palestinians. And that's part of it. That's part of this war as well, and we have to own that. But I certainly have a basic confidence in the IDF. Now, I know I've said lots of things here that go in lots of different directions. And partly that's because I think many of us are still trying to figure out what's happening and what should happen.
Yeah, and I think that's many people here as well. And I think actually a number of people that I speak to in the Jewish community there is a lot of overlap with the questions that you articulated. And I think part of what I appreciate is the honesty to be able to talk about these multiple directions, because they're all real, they're all legitimate, and they're all happening at the same time. And they take us away from the simplistic black and white nature of so much of our public conversation right now.
You know, one of the reasons I appreciate being here now in that this is a conversation that's very hard to have.
Yep. Yep.
It's much easier to have here.
Right. Yes, and I think that that's something that it's difficult for a lot of Americans, including a lot of American Jews, to fully appreciate. And I think part of it goes back in a sort of, if we have to say it in a very concise way, it goes back to something you said a few minutes ago, which is in Israel, it's still October 7th. And I think that as long as that remains the case in a very deep way, even, and I've heard you say this, I think you and I spoke about this previously, even for many people who know intellectually there are hard questions, who know intellectually that Gazans are suffering and that they want to have empathy for them, that at an emotional level, it's very hard to move past that trauma and that moment.
And the rage.
Yes, and the rage. Let me turn us in a different direction, which comes at us from the events of the last few days. And that is that we seem to be entering a new phase of this war with the entry of Iran in a more direct way. I have communicated that I can't really bear the people who say all of a sudden Israel attacked an Iranian outpost and then Iran responded to that initial aggression, given that Iran is the principal sponsor of a two-front war for the last 6 months against Israel on the part of Hamas and Hezbollah. But nonetheless, this is a new phase, and I'm wondering how you think it alters the nature of the conflict, what particular dangers it presents for Israel, and how these two fronts of the war may kind of unfold in relation to each other and the region.
So on October 8th, many Israelis concluded that what had happened the day before was the beginning of the Iranian-Israeli war. And that's certainly how I see events unfolding. It's just a question of time before this shifts from Gaza to much more intensively in the north. And we may very well be in a direct war with Iran at any moment. I mean, this could have turned out very differently the other night. And there's now, of course, active talk of retaliation. I don't like that word, and I don't want Israel to retaliate, but not for the reason that you're hearing all over the West. My reason is actually the opposite. I believe that we need to own the war with Iran. We need to have as a strategic goal the destruction of the Iranian regime, that when we're confronting a regime whose official policy is the destruction of Israel, and there's nothing abstract about that policy, as you say, Ethan. Iran's historic victory has been to surround Israel on its borders with Iranian proxies, everywhere we look. And now, in the last year or so, there were reports that Iran has been flooding the West Bank, which is the last border that Israel has managed to keep Iran away from. Iran has been flooding the West Bank with weapons and is preparing for a confrontation there as well. And so this is really an extraordinary strategic victory for Iran. Iran is not thousands of kilometers away from Israel. Iran is right next door to us. You can sit in Metula, which is the northernmost village in Israel, and look out from your porch into Lebanon and see a Hezbollah post. And of course, in Gaza, on the Gaza border, that was the case with Hamas. And so what we learned on October 7th was that we were living in a kind of a delusion for these last 2 decades, since the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas on our borders, which was roughly 2006 in the north, 2007 in Gaza. And we learned that when you're living next door to genocidal entities or regimes that are committed to your destruction, sooner or later you're going to wake up into October 7th. And so, at the very least, Israel's strategic goal, and it may not be fulfilled immediately, it may be in the next few years, but we are now in an active state of war, with these genocidal entities on our border. And what we've been doing is essentially fighting Iranian proxies instead of Iran itself. Now, we have attacked Iran in two ways. First, we've been trying to set back the nuclear development, and that's happening within Iran itself. And the second front has been in Syria and Iraq, with the Israeli Air Force trying to sabotage the transfer of sophisticated weapons from Iran to Hezbollah and Hamas. And we are now in a totally different phase of this war. It is now overt. And, you know, in one sense, Ethan, I feel a kind of relief, as strange as it is to say that. Because the perception that this is an Israeli-Palestinian war, in which, of course, Israel is Goliath and the Palestinians are David, is true if you have a narrow lens and you ignore the wider region. But the conflict was never only about Israel and the Palestinians. For most of Israel's existence, we were in a Sunni-Israeli war. The Sunni-Israeli war is ending. And if the Saudis, God willing, enter into the peace process, the Sunni-Israeli war is effectively over. We are now in a new phase where we are in a Shiite-Israeli war. And a friend of mine corrected me and said, you know, when you say that, you need to explain that we are at peace with Sunni governments, but not necessarily the Sunni peoples, who still regard Israel largely as illegitimate. And the paradox is that we are at war with Shiite governments, but not necessarily with the Shiite people. Certainly the people of Iran are probably the most pro-Israel nation in the Middle East, for obvious reasons, because of their regime. But in terms of our relationship with, excuse me, with the region, it is still a regional conflict, even though it's shifted. And so where we stand now is that the deceptive perception of this conflict as Israel versus the Palestinians is finally the lens is being widened. And at the very least, we're now looking at what this conflict is. And then people will have to choose sides. Would it be better for the Middle East if Israel wins the war or if Iran wins the war? And it's astonishing to me that you get more clarity about that question in the Middle East itself than you do in much of the West.
So I have a stack of questions here, and the reason I've had my phone out is not because I'm getting furious text messages from people who don't like my questions or want to tell me something important. It's because I'm keeping track of time. And so I want to get to those questions. I'm going to ask you one more question for the moment. So let's turn to what's been your most widely read book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And when you wrote that book, which I think is so moving and powerful, you did so as an opening up of a conversation that contained real vulnerability and empathy as part of a process of really trying to imagine what life was like for Palestinians and to explain to them the Jewish perspective on Zionism and the conflict. And my question is whether you think, I mean, it's not like things were great when you wrote that book. It was well after Oslo. It was, in a period, in a period that was quite challenging. But do you think you could have written that book today? And if the answer is no, what do you think is necessary to get us back to a place where you and others with similar inclinations could extend yourselves again in efforts toward mutual understanding?
So the answer is no. I couldn't write that book today. I don't have the capacity to dredge up empathy for the Palestinian national story. Not talking about Palestinian suffering, but for the counter-narrative, which was a very important part of pushing myself, pushing my limits, and making place for the counter-narrative. I don't have the space for that now. I don't have the ability. I'm a very mainstream, ordinary Israeli in my reactions. I'm in a state of mourning and rage. I'm trying to work on the rage. It's never good to be in a state of rage, but certainly mourning. And I don't, Ethan, I don't regret at all. I don't regret writing that book. I'm very happy that I wrote it. And the book is having a new life since October 7th, and I'm very happy about that. Not happy about the reasons for it, but I'm glad that it's a book that people can turn to, and especially young Jews, and feel that they can get a language for speaking about this conflict. And that means a lot to me. And I certainly don't disavow anything that I wrote there. I believe that the occupation is a disaster for Israel. I believe that for our long-term, not just well-being, but really viability, we need to extricate ourselves from the occupation. I still believe in principle in a two-state solution. But wait. The applause is premature. And I, when I did the book tour, I always warned audiences. I would turn to the left and to the right. You're going to hear something that I say, and you're going to just be really excited about it. But bear in mind that the opposite point of view is coming, because I'm not left and I'm not right. I'm a centrist. And the center in Israel is the least understood political position abroad. A centrist has two sides, a left-wing side and a right-wing side. So you can applaud my left-wing side, but know that the right-wing side is coming. And so the right-wing side says that to the left-wing side, yes, a Palestinian state may be an existential need, but a Palestinian state is also an existential threat. Applause. So the funny thing about October 7th is that it reinforced. Excuse me. This is week 3 or 4 of a lecture tour, so my voice. October 7th reinforced both of those arguments. On the one hand, speak to Israelis today. Is a Palestinian state possible in the West Bank? Almost all will tell you, you've got to be out of your mind. How could we possibly risk creating a second Gaza on our most sensitive border, which is the West Bank, which overlooks greater Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? And so that's one argument that seems to be irrefutable. But there's a second counter-argument that October 7th, I think, also vindicated, which is the Palestinian people and the Israeli people cannot coexist in one political entity between the river and the sea. October 7th proved that. It validated Ariel Sharon's decision to pull us out of Gaza. How can we possibly live with Gaza in one political framework? Whether we're in control or they're in control, however one envisions a one state, it would be a far greater nightmare than what we're experiencing. And so the only reason that I'm still for a two-state solution, which I dread, especially after October 7th, it is almost my worst nightmare. The only nightmare that's worse than a two-state solution is not having a two-state solution, but just barely, and not every day. I don't feel that way every day, I certainly didn't feel that way October 8th. So it's much more complicated than we need a two-state solution, we can have a two-state solution. A centrist position essentially internalizes the debate so that it's not happening out there between two rival camps. It's happening inside of me and inside of many Israelis. And I hope that as we distance ourselves from emotionally, as we begin the very long process of healing from October 7th, that more Israelis will come to the position that October 7th isn't only a definitive validation against the Palestinian state, it also tells us that the opposite position has validity too.
Thank you so much, Yossi. So we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of good questions, a few bad questions.
But what we actually, Ethan, what we have not yet had are heckling. Now, I'm a Zionist.
You like to tempt fate, Yossi.
I'm in Berkeley. How am I going to tell my friends back in Israel? First of all, they won't believe me. And secondly, it's like, well, maybe you just don't really matter as much as you thought you did. And so if you are out there in the audience, this is your moment. So.
Okay, so one of the questions we had was, Yossi, you seem disappointed that there aren't any hecklers. Can you explain? Okay. Let's start with a question that's very close to campus, and I know it's something you think about a lot. What do you say to young Jewish students who see a large gap between their sense of their liberal values and their view of the Israeli government today?
There isn't a large gap, there's an abyss. And they need to hold on to that. And one of the messages that many of us in Israel who are involved in the democracy movement over this last year has been aimed at the diaspora is that this is your struggle too. There was no movement that I know of in contemporary life, no democracy movement, no movement to save a country's democratic institutions that was more powerful, more consistent than the Israeli democracy movement. We did not stop for a moment. And the government kept expecting this to die out. They're going to lose energy. And I can tell you that had October 7th not happened, we'd still be out there in the same numbers, maybe greater. Every Saturday night, 150,000, 250,000 people all over the country. And we were fighting for the decency of Israel. And that's a struggle that's going to define this generation. And so my plea to young liberal Jews is that it's not only up to me to make sure that the Jewish people has a state that it can be proud of. This is a responsibility of diaspora Jews as well. And don't leave us alone in this struggle. This is a struggle of the Jewish people. The identity of Israel, the nature of Israeli society is far more an appropriate, to my mind, diaspora struggle than and certainly you have a much better chance of being heard in Israel than offering us strategic advice, which Israelis really don't listen to. We should, but we don't. And we really need that kind of partnership. So I think that we need a new model for Israeli diaspora relations, a relationship of genuine partnership, which is not just you support us and we'll tell you how to support us, but a much deeper way of looking at how this relationship became so dysfunctional that before October 7th, we were looking at the possibility of a historic divorce between the two great centers of Jewish life. How did it come to that? And we really need to be asking that question now. So the question that you asked is really, for me, is part of a larger question, which is what is the future of this relationship, and how do we begin to reconceive it post-October 7th?
So we have a few different questions here about Israel's prime minister, of whom you are very publicly not a great fan, to put it mildly.
Do you know I dream about him? I actually, no, this is true. I dream about him. I had a dream maybe a few months ago where we were wrestling with each other. And he bit me. He bit me. And I woke up, I was so outraged. And I think about that, and I still feel it viscerally. How dare he? And the truth is, that's exactly what he's done. He has taken a bite out of our being. So no.
Right. So the question, which I think is a fair one, that I'm going to go to here is, how can you have such harsh critique of Bibi while not acknowledging that he was elected and re-elected over and over again by the Israeli public over a period of more than 20 years? And how can this not diminish the credibility of Israel?
So it's an important question, and I have what I think are credible answers. First of all, Netanyahu tried, and for me he's not Bibi, I have to tell you. Bibi is too intimate, it's too friendly, and he's not Bibi. And I was not a Netanyahu hater. In the past I voted for him, and even when I stopped voting for him, I respected him. I appreciated what he had done for Israel. And what he has undone in the last year and a half is essentially his entire legacy. But back to the question. Netanyahu tried to be elected 4 times before this last election and failed for 4 times. And created a crisis in the Israeli political system that essentially froze government for 3 years until we had a brief period of sanity where the Bennett-Lapid Abbas government came in. And Netanyahu in 2023, the election that he won, actually did not win the popular vote. He won 49 point something of the popular vote. Because of the intricacies of our coalition politics, he was able to put a coalition together. He claimed that he represented the majority of Israelis. And what he meant by that, he did get a majority of the Jewish Israeli vote. Now, the last time I looked, Arab Israelis had the right to vote, and their votes were not a matter of facade, but their votes actually count in a democracy. And so technically, Netanyahu did not get a majority, the majority that he claims. So just on that basis alone, for me, he's already invalidated himself as a democratic leader. But it's deeper than that, because he ran, as he's always run, on his ticket of security. He did not discuss the judicial revolution that he began immediately, the week of his government's formation. The judicial revolution began. Cabinet ministers within the Likud did not know the details of the judicial plan. Israelis were asked in polls, Likud voters, did you know, did you expect this? No. A majority of Likud supporters did not support the judicial revolution if it meant tearing the country apart. Netanyahu did not have a mandate for what he was doing. And he claimed one. And the final point here is that even if he had received an overwhelming majority of across the board, he had won a strong and clear majority, a democratically elected leader does not have the right to destroy democratic institutions. We have a Supreme Court. We have, now I don't know if that's relevant in this country, but you'd be surprised that there are leaders in a democracy who actually are enemies of democratic institutions. And so there is no democratic legitimacy to do. What Netanyahu was doing was really trying to turn Israel into another Hungary. And in Hungary, you have supposedly democratic elections. I have no doubt that Netanyahu was heading in the direction of Hungary, which was to strip democratic institutions of their power and reduce democracy to the formal election every few years of the government, while making sure that the elections are rigged. Now, that hadn't happened yet in Israel, because in the end, we saved the courts. And in the end, we prevented the government from totally destroying the independent media, as Orban did in Hungary. We prevented that from happening. But that was Orban was the blueprint. And he remains the favorite leader of the Likud. This is not Menachem Begin's Likud. This is also something that many right-wing American Jews did not understand. This is not the Likud that we knew. And Benny Begin, Menachem's son, said this at one of our rallies. He said that for my father, the Likud was a liberal nationalist party. Now that sounds like an oxymoron to American sensibilities. For Israelis, until these last few years, until Netanyahu destroyed the old Likud, the Likud was a liberal nationalist party, and we all understood what that meant. Today, as Benny Begin said, the Likud is now an illiberal, ultra-nationalist party. And so this is not our old Likud. And for me, Netanyahu lost his legitimacy.
Okay, some tougher questions. Several people have asked questions connected to specific aspects of the conduct of the war. There have been points about credible reports that the IDF is using AI technology in ways that have targeted civilians, questions about the practice of starvation in war and how that corresponds to ideas of fighting a just war justly. Other questions about whether Netanyahu's government should be considered part of the reason for what many perceive as an acute level of brutality in the war. So how do you respond to these hard questions about what seem to many to be practices that go beyond even a very intensive war into something that many are characterizing, forgive me, as war crimes?
Yeah, so hard and important questions. So first of all, in terms of AI, and I don't know the details, my sense is that the army is using AI to ferret out Hamas fighters who blend in with the civilian population. It's using it for facial recognition. And I think that that's not just a credible use of AI, but a necessary use. If there's something else that the questioner was referring to, please say so.
Sorry, I'll repeat
Yes.
the question for those who couldn't hear it. So the follow-up question was based upon a New Yorker article that reported that the sheer quantity of targets using AI technology has led to tremendous civilian casualties as one of the reasons, and part of the problem is the lack of human assessment as a backup for the use of AI technology, that's led to many of the cases of civilian casualties.
So I didn't see the article, but my guess is that the article did not explain the context with which Israeli soldiers are fighting this war, what this war is actually like. That's my guess based on reading the way this war is increasingly covered in the New York Times and elsewhere, that the context is being erased. And what I said earlier may apply in this case as well, which is that the army does not target civilians, but is not necessarily doing all it can and should do to protect innocent civilians. I think that that's an important distinction, and when that distinction is made, then I feel very comfortable going into those accusations. But I need that distinction to be made. So the second question was?
Starvation.
Yeah, the Israeli government made a very stupid decision on October 8th, which was to announce a policy that was completely unenforceable, which was a siege, total siege of Gaza. No food going in. And that lasted all of 3 days until the Biden administration made sure that we did not do that. And in the aftermath of October 7th, especially with the hostages in Gaza, I'd say there was widespread sympathy for that policy. We are going to apply the food weapon until you give up our hostages. That policy cannot be applied by a civilized state. It is beyond the pale. And I don't believe that the army has used food as a weapon. I do not believe that. I do believe that the army, and especially the government, has not prioritized until recently. Now I think the situation is belatedly better. But the army neglected its responsibilities. I see it more in those terms. And that's a serious enough failure. And in the commission of inquiry that will be established for October 7th and the aftermath, that for me is a necessary question. I wonder whether in the Israel of today that question will even be asked. I don't know. The third question?
The third question was about whether or not you think this government bears responsibility for some of the excesses of brutality, as many would characterize them, that have gone on in this war.
It's, there's a misconception about who's running the war. It is this government, but it's only a small part of the government. It's the war cabinet. It's not the general cabinet. It's not even the security cabinet. There are essentially 3 levels now of cabinet. And the innermost cabinet is the war cabinet. And of the half dozen ministers that sit there, I have pretty much confidence in 5 out of the 6. The 6th happens to be the prime minister. Now, the way things work in Israel is that the prime minister is actually not the equivalent of the president of the United States in war. The prime minister is not the commander-in-chief. He's the first among equals. He obviously has great weight, but the prime minister can't unilaterally make decisions. The prime minister cannot unilaterally extend the war for his own political purposes. Would he do that if he could? I have very little doubt that he would. I put almost nothing past this iteration of Netanyahu, as opposed to the Netanyahu we once knew, who was a mixture of patriotic instincts and base instincts. Netanyahu has become the sum total of his human failures. But Netanyahu is not running this war. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the far right, aren't close to the table where decisions are made, and they are beside themselves. They will run in the next election, almost certainly, on the ticket that accuses the Likud of giving in to, quote, the left, and of freezing them out of the decision-making. And the reason we didn't win the war decisively is because they weren't at the table. But you have to understand, they're not at the table, which means that whatever brutality is playing out is playing out on the individual initiative of soldiers or officers on the field. And we know that that's part of, yes, that is part of how the army also functions. You will have individuals who break the rules, the ethical bounds that the army sets out, and we see that happening on the ground in Gaza. I don't know to what extent, but you know, when you send in a people's army, which means that it's a cross-section of a society, into a fraught situation, into a situation where terrorists are embedded in a civilian population, with all of the emotions of October 7th, you're asking for trouble. And so I'm sure that that's part of what's being played out. Has the army effectively policed itself? I have questions. That's part of my question. But what this question is asking, which is, are these instances of brutality coming from above, not from the higher echelons of the army, that's for certain, and not from the war cabinet? So the answer is no. As ugly as this government is in its aggregate, the core of the cabinet that's directing this war is essentially credible.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on what you just said, Yossi. Not really, I think, to disagree with you, except to say you yourself said earlier that Israel made a fundamental decision in this war to not let Hamas hide behind the kinds of institutions and civilian population centers that they have effectively been able to hide behind before. And without necessarily arguing that that was the wrong decision, it was a decision ultimately of the war cabinet or the generals, and it is a decision that unquestionably has led to greater loss of civilian life, even if we believe that it was a just decision because we believe Israel had no choice. So I think it's important to grapple with that, honestly.
Yeah, I think that those of us who support this war have to own that. We have to own the consequences of the decision to not grant Hamas immunity behind the civilian population. And that has had terrible results. But that's a decision that, as I said earlier, virtually the entire Jewish population in Israel made. And I was reading an op-ed, I don't know how many of you saw the op-ed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago by David Grossman, one of Israel's greatest writers, and also Israel's, in some way, leading peace advocate. He's the conscience of Israel. David Grossman opposed most of the recent war. Since the 1982 Lebanon war, he's been out there questioning the wars. And I'm reading this op-ed in the New York Times and waiting for some opposition, and it's not there. Now, he raises serious questions about the morning after, about the ways in which, certain questions about how the war is being fought, but no questioning about the justness of this war, and fully owning, implicitly fully owning, the decision not to grant Hamas immunity. That's what makes this war different from all our other mini wars against Hamas. This is the war that we decided Hamas has no immunity. And all the consequences come from that decision. And it's one of the hardest, ugliest decisions that we have ever had to make, and to my mind, unavoidable.
But what about the dumb bombs?
The dumb bombs.
We're not actually taking questions directly from the audience, but we did have a question here in the cards about that as another aspect of this war. So if you'd like to comment on the dumb bombs.
Yeah, my sense is that, I asked someone in the government who I deeply trust, not on the political side of the government, but on the civil service side, who is intimately involved in these decisions. And what he said was that we didn't go into details, but what he said was that every decision to drop ordnance has to be approved by a legal panel. No decision is made arbitrarily. And mistakes can happen, miscalculations can happen. As far as whether that decision was enough for me, it's part of the mix. In other words, I know that the decision-making process is not arbitrary. On the other hand, and this was true especially in the early days of the war, and I believe that the dumb bombs were used more in the early days, phosphorus bombs. It's certainly not happening now. And were decisions made in those early days in the way that were consistent with the Army's own rules? I don't know. I have questions. The atmosphere in Israel in those first weeks after October 7th, I've never experienced anything like that. I've lived in Israel for more than 40 years. I've experienced everything that Israel can throw at you. And this was something new. And did we have failures? Of course we had failures. Do we still have failures? I'm sure we do. I think less than we did in the early days. And that's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And Israel is a country. Sometimes it's hard for diaspora Jews, for understandable reasons, to grasp what that means. Because for diaspora Jews, Jewish identity is rooted primarily in history and ethics, in the ethos as we're coming to Passover. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And in Israel, Jewish identity works differently. And in Israel, it's much more about peoplehood, about defending the country. And because we play out our understanding of Jewish identity differently, there tends to be a shock in the diaspora. And again, I understand this, but there tends to be a shock when Israel or Israelis act the way other countries would react in their place. I was here for 9/11. I happen to have been here. I wrote a book that was supposed to be released on 9/11. It was actually about a journey that I took into Islam. And never mind about the book. But the point is that I saw the way people were reacting. I saw the way Muslims were being treated at the airport in the aftermath. I saw the hatred, the rage, and it was ugly. And I'm not saying that to defend the reaction in America or to defend the reaction in Israel. But it's sometimes a little shocking for diaspora Jews when Israelis act like normal people. And I don't want us to act like normal people, not in that sense. because there was ugliness there, and we're being called on it. And the irony, and this is a much longer answer than I imagine you have more, but just one last point. There's such an extraordinary irony here, which is that when we act like when we act as badly as any other people, the world doesn't let us get away with it. So we think, what do you want from us? We're just doing what you would do in our place. And the world says, well, wait a minute, there seems to be different rules for the Jews. And politically, I resent that. Politically, don't put me on a pedestal and then knock me down. As a religious Jew, I have to say that it's a complicated dynamic, because if I believe that Jewish history and Judaism is setting very high standards for us, and a 4,000-year-old people needs to act with depth and wisdom and not act in an immature way, then what does it mean that the world doesn't let us get away with acting like any other country? Does that mean that we're really not a normal people, that Zionism was wrong to try to turn us into a normal people? I know we're getting theological here, but it raises not only political questions. For political questions, we have answers. Well, look at what China is doing, to the Uyghurs, and look what Syria does. And yes, I think that that's an important response to those who would criminalize us. But as an internal Jewish conversation, we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to be compared to Syria? Is that our moral frame of reference? And why can't we seem to get away with acting as badly as everybody else? That's a really important, for me, a religious question.
So we are over time, and I'm going to take the liberty of asking you one last question, if that's okay. I have many more, and we have this pile of cards here that are all over the table, and I apologize for all of you who had good questions we didn't get to. But I want to bring it back to where we're sitting here, and it speaks to a number of the questions that I haven't gotten to ask yet, and that is, what do you do with the fact that we have a tremendous generational divide that we are facing in America, in American Jewry? And we have a growing number of young Jews in this country who are asking very hard questions about why they should be attached to Israel, what they should do with a state that behaves as badly as any other, to go back. That they may put the question far more critically, but they look at this war, they look at the sense that they feel of injustice in certain aspects of the war. They don't necessarily, one questioner said that the Zionism that you expressed is an artifact of an older generation. And the question is, what is your message to them, and how do you think that we speak across this generational divide to re-engage young American Jews on a wider scale, particularly those for whom justice is fundamental to how they see their Jewishness?
So my first response would be that if you take your Jewish identity seriously, and I don't have a real conversation with American Jews who don't take their Jewishness seriously, and I respect everyone's decision to work out their own identities. But if you do take your Jewishness seriously, you have to grapple with Israel. There is no Jewish story, this 4,000-year story, without a relationship to the land of Israel at the very least. And there is no way to avoid the significance of Israel in Jewish history. And to be part of a people that longed for this frankly absurd vision that one day we would be gathered up, the most powerless people in the world would be gathered up from 100 countries and reestablish its national sovereignty in its lost ancient homeland, and then actually does it, you can't avoid that story if you take your Jewishness seriously. You have to, at the very least, you have to grapple with it, and you have to take the story seriously. And that means that a people that spent 2,000 years in active anticipation of return can't give up on that story when it actually is fulfilled. It's, Mao Zedong famously said when he was asked about how do you see the consequences of the French Revolution, and he said, it's too early to tell. And look, it's Berkeley, come on, let me quote Mao Zedong. So 76 years after the establishment of the state, when we haven't known a day's peace, when a country born in war that has been delegitimized, subjected to every form of attack, that has tried in its way to hold on to its democratic institutions despite being under constant assault, that has made every possible mistake it can make in so many ways, and yet is still an extraordinary success story. You have to grapple with that story seriously and not respond to that story as an outsider, being swept up in the critique of outsiders. And if you're going to relate to that story superficially and allow the judgment of outsiders to define what this story means, then you're not part of the story. You're not a responsible participant in the story. It also means, and it's what I was trying to say earlier about the democracy movement, we have a real struggle in Israel. And are you a part of that or not? Do you see helping shape the identity of Israel, the nature of Israeli society, the future of this story as something that impinges on you? And so if you do, then let's have a serious conversation about what is Israel, what Israel means, how do we get to a better Israel? What are the problems? How did we get to this point? If you're just coming at me and saying, well, I care about justice and the occupation and the war, I said, okay, but if that's the sum total of this story, then you're not taking your role seriously. I spoke to a group of rabbis affiliated with J Street about a year or so ago. And I talked about the gratitude that Jews should feel to the two flags on the bima, that these are the two flags that represent the Jewish people's resurrection after the Shoah. And one of the rabbis said, for my young congregants, the American flag represents imperialism and the Israeli flag represents occupation. And my response was, well, what do you say to that? You're a rabbi, you're an educator. What's your response? And he said, well, hasbara doesn't work anymore, propaganda, hasbara. And I said, gratitude is not hasbara. Gratitude is a religious value, and it's a spiritual value. And how do you not try to explain to your young congregants that the basis, before we unpack all the problems of what those two flags represent, what those two flags immediately should mean to every Jew, is these are the sources of our renewal. And whatever those two flags mean, whatever the Israeli flag means for Palestinians, and I don't want to avoid that, whatever the American flag means for those who were excluded from the American dream and in the opposite way in which Jews were eventually included, that doesn't take away from the need for Jews to feel gratitude. And so this is the conversation that I think we need to have. And one last point here, which is that as long as we restrict the Israeli diaspora conversation to political issues, we are going to be heading over the cliff. we need to be developing deep relationships between these two communities. Personal relationships, religious relationships. Israelis need to understand and respect the forms of Judaism that American Jewry has created. And we don't understand that at all. And American Jews need to understand and respect the circumstances under which Israelis have tried to create this state from day one of our existence. And so we need to really begin speaking to each other. We need to understand each other's culture, which we don't. We have some of the greatest music that's being created, I think, anywhere. Certainly it's the greatest Jewish music that's being created in our generation. And American Jews don't know it. And American Jews don't know Hebrew. And that's a scandal that I refuse to accept. And so there's so much that we need to do in order to have a serious relationship. And that if the starting point is, well, the occupation and this war and justice, that's not a serious Jewish conversation. That needs to be part of a much larger Israeli diaspora conversation. And we need to figure out ways of creating a real Jewish people, because right now, we're not functioning as a real people. And that's, for me, that's the great challenge for the morning after in our internal relationship. That's it.